who is actually a Japanese American artist. Alright, let's take a look at what we have inside. As a small heads up, if you've watched my channel before, you will already know, but I do have dyslexia, so my reading is not the greatest. Some people might find that a little bit relaxing because I'll probably be repeating some words. Other people may find it annoying. For hope. But I'm just gonna do my best. Doing videos like this is great practice for me to get better at something that I'm not that very good at. So, without further ado, here we go. Once upon a time, there lived a king and queen whose fondest desire was to have a child, a little one to bounce on her knee, they would wistfully say. They wistfully said every day. A year passed, then 3. Yet they remained without a child still. Just when the loving couple thought their wish would remain forever unfulfilled, the queen began to bathe at a secluded pond where there lived an ancient frog. She sang to the old creature as sweetly as she would to a child of her own. To the queen's great surprise, one day the frog sprang from his perch and began to speak. To one far more fair than I should so sweet be sung. Within 12 months' time, a daughter to you shall be born. Exciting. So here we see the queen bathing, and the frog who's making her the promise. Apologies for any traffic sounds. I live on a very high floor, so it can sneak in quite a bit. And just as the frog said, a little girl was soon born to the queen. The king was so overcome with joy that he could barely contain himself. The child was called Aurora, and the king ordered a great christening feast to celebrate. Every relative, friend, and any other acquaintance of importance was invited, and the royal squires were sent to search out all of the fairies who inhabited his realm. So here's Aurora's mother with Aurora. Now, it happened that to invite the fairies required very special golden place settings for each. The king had just 12, and they were very costly indeed, even for a king. When the squires returned and announced that 13 fairies were living in his land, the king became quite vexed, for his treasures were nearly as dear to him as his daughter. But when he learned that the 13th was a very old fairy who had not been seen for more than 50 years, the king happily concluded she must be either dead or under some spell. Surely there is no need to inquire further. When at last the the ceremonies were over, the guests retired to the king's palace, where the attendance of all fairies was to be celebrated at the feast. Each of the 12 places was set in magnificent style indeed, while plates and cups of beaten gold and jeweled chests containing a knife, fork, and spoon, all inlaid with precious stones. The table was laid with bowls and some glasses of crystal, and all was set a-glitter by candles too numerous to count. After a splendid meal, each fairy presented the child with a magic gift. One gave virtue, another wisdom, a third beauty, and so on, until the Princess Aurora had been assured nearly every good fortune in life. Just as the 11th fairy bestowed her wish, the 13th fairy, who was very much alive after all, appeared in a flash. And here's a picture of the 13th fairy appearing. So we have Aurora's father, the king, Aurora's mother, the queen, Aurora, the 12 other fairies, and the 13th fairy, who's very angry. And now you may have my gift, the old fairy exclaimed angrily. On her 16th birthday, the princess shall prick her finger with a spindle and die. Without another word, she turned and stormed out of the hall. The fearful prophecy caused the guests to shudder, and the gentler souls among them wept. Almost out of their wits with grief, the king and queen now despaired of the terrible cost of the king's rash and selfish decision to ignore the 13th fairy. But now the 12th fairy, whose gift was still unspoken, stepped forward. Your Majesties, calm yourselves. Although my powers cannot alter my elder sister's terrible wish, the princess shall not die. Instead, Aurora shall fall into a deep sleep that will last 100 years. With that, she and all of the rest of the fairies vanished. So you can see in this picture the 12th fairy granting them her wish, and the king and queen coddling Aurora. The very next morning, the king's squires carried decrees to the farthest corners of the land, commanding every spindle be immediately destroyed. By this, the king sought to protect his child from the misfortune he had caused, and as years passed, so it seemed he had. Meanwhile, the other fairies' gifts were all fulfilled, and Aurora grew into a maiden of great beauty, so gentle, kind, and clever that everyone who happened upon her could not help but love her. On the day of her 16th birthday, the king and queen had gone out to find a very special gift, and the princess was left in the castle, free to do as she pleased. She looked about in every curious place, exploring as she might. Here she is exploring. Here's Aurora playing some music, because she's so talented and so gifted. find it interesting?" "Oh yes, it looks such a merry thing to do," the princess said. "May I try too?" "Why, of course, my dear," the old woman said, but mind the spindle," she added cunningly, for it had very special powers. Indeed, the moment the wheel began to turn, the spindle threw off a shower of glowing light in every direction. "How beautiful!" Aurora exclaimed. Enchanted, she could not resist examining the spinning shaft. But the instant she touched it, the sharp point pricked her finger. The old fairy, for that is who the old woman really was, smiled, revealing in her deed, then vanished without a trace. The princess collapsed on the floor, and the spell immediately took hold. Here's Aurora discovering the 13th fairy disguised as the old woman spinning. At once, sleep fell over the entire palace, and an eerie silence came over all. In the stables, the horses knelt and slept. The doves in the eaves stopped cooing, and even the dragonflies upon the moat ceased to stir. The fire upon the hearth died away, and the cook, who had just caught his lazy kitchen lad by the scruff of the neck, lost his hold, and they tumbled apart like two court jesters, snoring loudly. The wind stopped, and not even the tiniest spider web stirred so much as the breath. I think that was lightning. It's starting to rain outside. Yeah, that was definitely lightning. Okay, that's spooky. Well, what a fun time to be reading a book. Okay, so we have some lightning and thunder. So, what a fun way to keep reading. Okay, where was I? Okay. When the king and queen returned and beheld the cruel work of the old fairy, their eyes welled up with tears, and they sobbed uncontrollably. All their efforts had been in vain. Deep in sorrow, the king and queen lovingly laid their daughter on a bed covered with the finest embroidery in the most elegant room atop the tallest tower. Aurora's soft cheeks were flushed delicately. I think that was another flash of lightning. Will there be any thunder? This is kind of scary. Okay. We're flushed delicately with the petals of a rose, and though her eyes were indeed closed, the gentle rise and fall of her bosom made it plain she was still alive. So I think this is the king and queen as everybody is falling asleep around them. When the king beheld this sight, he drew back in fear. Such was his guilt over his daughter's plight. Nevertheless, he was down to the gates of his palace, and with a mournful face offered his hand in welcome to welcome her. So here is the fairy and her 3 dragons. It's a pretty fashionable way to travel. Okay. Once again, the majesties were comforted by the good fairy. Then, as she bid them goodbye, she touched the grieving couple with her wand, and they, like all the rest, fell fast asleep. Briars suddenly sprang up out of the earth and grew around the castle. Every moment the bramble, full of thorny spikes, grew taller and wider until only the very tip of the tower where Aurora lay remained visible to give any clue of what lay within. From the mysterious thorny tangle there soon spread throughout the land the legend of Briar Rose, as the sleeping princess became known from time to time. Princes heard of the legend and set out on vain quests to penetrate the hedge and reach the castle, though many a gallant young prince entered, even when fully clad in battle dress, none were ever seen again. It's a bit scary and sad. So here are the king and queen asleep together. After many years, when no one any longer bothered to challenge the fearful briars, a young prince from a faraway land found his way into the kingdom. The tender-hearted lad kept a falcon as a companion. When he loosed it for exercise, it flew immediately high above the brambles, where it circled curiously round and round. The moment the prince's eye fell upon the tower, he had to know what lay inside. Now, the curious prince asked everyone he came upon about the tower in the bramble. Some said it was infested with evil spirits. Others said it was used by sorcerers. And many believed there lived a powerful orc who carried off wayward children to eat for a tasty morsel after dinner. Finally, one day, the prince came upon an old peasant woman, hobbled by age. She told the legend of the briars, how behind them stood the tower of a great castle where slept a princess beautiful beyond words called Briar Rose. She told of how the princess had lain in slumber nearly 100 years, together with the king and queen and all their court. But she also told the young prince of many of the others who had come to the mysterious briar, only to disappear into them, never again to find their way back. The handsome youth would not be daunted. No matter what the outcome, I must make my way to the tower, he declared. And though the thought of a sleeping beauty such as Briar Rose laying unprotected in a thorny prison was much more than his good and valiant nature could bear. So here you see the knight, or the prince, with his falcon. The prince prepared as though for a great battle, yet when he set upon the first thorny branch, to his amazement it only fell away harmlessly before him. A wide opening appeared as he strode into it. The bramble immediately closed behind, so that his retinue was barred from following. Still, the prince continued without the slightest fear. He soon arrived at a large forecourt. Around him everywhere lay the bodies of men, women, and animals. A fearful silence and a semblance of death lay over all. But then the prince realized that was another lightning flash. So we'll probably get some thunder. But then the prince realized a rubby blush never found on the dead body lay over. Kind of spooky. Where was I? But then the prince realized a ruddy blush never found on the dead lay over the porter's faces. Their plates, still laden with half-eaten food, revealed that sleep had taken them even as they dined. As he went on, he found courtier and servant alike fast asleep, and in the hall above the king and queen rested just as they had collapsed. Everything was just as old peasant had told. Everything was just as the old peasant had told. The silence was so great, the prince could hear the beating of his own heart as he came to the tower where Briar Rose slept. When at last he reached the door to her chamber, it swung away of its own accord, and there was revealed the sleeping princess. As if beholding a slumbering angel, the prince could not turn away his gaze. The power of her beauty was such that he immediately bent over and kissed her delicate lips. A clock struck the hour. 100 years after she pricked her finger, the princess opened her eyes. Her enchantment was broken. So here is the prince walking through the rose garden. And here is the princess lying where she's lain for 100 years. And the prince, not asking for consent, sweet prince, Aurora replied. These many long years only you have filled my dreams, for none other could awaken me from my spell. Now, in love's sweet name, at last our hearts will together be eternally bonded. Arm in arm, prince and princess went first to the king and queen, whom they immediately awakened. When they beheld their daughter and the adoring escort, their joy was overwhelming, for they thought never to see the princess alive again. Suddenly, the palace came to life. In the stables the horses neighed and shook their manes. The doves in the eaves began to coo once more, and even the dragonflies continued their flight. In the kitchen, the fire sprang up, and the cook and his lazy boy awoke and started a moment in surprise. Then the lad got the cuff of the ear. Then the lad got the cuff on the ear he had deserved for 100 years. The thick tangle of briars fell away and disappeared, and in the surrounding courtyard, the surrounding countryside, tales of the reappearance of the castle filled the gossip of every house, night fire, and tavern for leagues around. So here is the prince and Princess Aurora shortly after meeting. You might be hearing a little bit of rain outside. By and by, the wedding was announced, and the king spared no expense in inviting all. The marriage was celebrated grandly. So great was the love of Aurora and the prince that their joy spread throughout the kingdom. By their many good and kindly deeds, they became revered by the people to the end of their days. To the end of their days, they lived happily and contented with life. To the end of their days, they lived happy and contented lives, and thus the story of Briar Rose, who we now know as Sleeping Beauty, is remembered even till this day. That was one more. Strike of lightning. And with that, we reach the end. Thank you so much for joining me this evening in reading Sleeping Beauty and looking at the beautiful illustrations